Tom Callahan had once known the sound of laughter, the kind that filled a room and made the walls feel alive. But those days had faded into dust long ago, just like everything else that couldn't survive the harsh sun of the Arizona frontier. Now, he lived alone on the edge of nowhere, a quiet stretch of desert where the wind carried no voices, only the whisper of dry grass and the low moan of distant coyotes. He was a ranch owner, not a drifter. The kind of man who had built his home with his own hands, plank by plank, nail by nail. It wasn't much, just a small wooden house with a sagging porch, a weathered barn, and a corral where 2 horses grazed lazily under the pale light of dawn. But to Tom, it was enough. Enough space to breathe, enough silence to think, enough solitude to keep the world at a safe distance. Every morning, before the sun broke the horizon, he rose from his creaky bed, poured black coffee into a tin cup, and stepped outside into the cool stillness. The desert stretched endlessly before him, gold, red, and bone white beneath the coming light. He would check the fences, tighten the posts, and make sure the troughs were full. Then he'd brush the dust from his old mare's coat and speak to her softly, as if she were the last friend he had left. People in town called him the man who lives with the wind. They said it half in jest, half in wonder. He was quiet, polite, and steady, the kind of man who never raised his voice, never joined in laughter at the saloon, and never stayed long enough for anyone to really know him. He'd ride into town once every few weeks for feed and supplies, exchange a few words with the storekeeper, and leave before the dust from his boots had settled. No one asked questions, and Tom never offered answers. Still, anyone who looked close enough could see it, that heavy stillness in his eyes, the kind that comes from losing something you never learned how to talk about. It wasn't sadness exactly, more like a quiet weight, a burden worn smooth over the years. Some men carry their pain in scars. Tom carried his in silence. In the evenings, he'd sit on the porch as the sky turned crimson and the air cooled. The sun would dip low, painting the land in firelight, and the shadows would stretch long and thin across the valley. Those were his favorite hours. The world hushed, the day ending, and no one around to remind him of what he'd left behind. He didn't pray. He didn't write. He didn't sing. He just listened. To the crackle of the wood in the stove, to the wind slipping through the mesquite trees, to the distant cry of a hawk fading into the dusk. Tom Callahan had carved out a small corner of peace in a wild, untamed world. But peace is a fragile thing on the frontier. It can break without warning, shattered by a sound, a shadow, or the faint rustle of footsteps by the river. The sun was bleeding out behind the mountains when Tom Callahan heard it, a sound that didn't belong to the desert. He was closing the gate near the river, the same gate he'd fixed 100 times before, when a faint rustle drifted through the still air. It wasn't the shuffle of cattle or the sharp hiss of a rattler. It was softer, hesitant. Tom froze, one hand on the latch, his eyes narrowing toward the dusky water that snaked through the canyon floor. The light was low, the kind of gold that turned everything half real, half shadow. For a second, he thought it might be one of his horses wandering off. But then he saw her, a girl, standing by the riverbank, barefoot, still as a ghost. Her dress, what was left of it, was torn and coated with dust. Her long black hair hung in heavy strands down her back, glinting in the fading light. The desert wind caught the fabric, tugging it gently, and Tom could see how thin she was, bones sharp beneath skin, eyes wide and frightened. She couldn't have been more than 15, 16 at most. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The river whispered between them, carrying the smell of wet stone and desert sage. Tom's pulse quickened in his ears. It had been years since anyone set foot on his land uninvited. Folks didn't come out this far without a reason, and reasons in the desert usually meant trouble. But something in the way she stood there stopped him from reaching for his gun. She wasn't a threat. She was scared, like a wild creature backed into a corner. Tom cleared his throat, his voice low, careful, almost tender. "Evening, miss. You can't stay out here. Sun's gone. Coyotes will be out soon." The girl didn't answer. Didn't even seem to understand. She just looked at him, eyes glimmering like dark water, shoulders trembling though the night hadn't yet turned cold. Tom took a slow step forward. She didn't run. Another step. Still, she held her ground. When he was close enough, he saw the cut on her ankle, dried blood tracing down to her heel. Her feet were raw from walking barefoot over the desert stones. Something tightened in his chest. Not fear, not suspicion, but a quiet ache he hadn't felt in years. "You hurt," he muttered, half to himself. Then, softer. "Come on now. You can't stay out here." He gestured toward his house, a small speck of warm light across the field. The girl followed his gaze, her eyes narrowing as if measuring the distance. She said nothing, but her breathing eased, and she shifted her weight forward, just an inch, but enough. Tom didn't press her. He only turned, started walking slowly up the path, his boots crunching against the dry earth. He didn't look back right away, afraid she might vanish if he did. But then he heard it. The faint sound of bare feet behind him. She was following. The walk back was quiet. The world around them glowed faintly in the last of the sunset, long shadows stretching across the open land. Tom kept his pace steady, making sure she could keep up. Once, he glanced over his shoulder. She was still there, eyes down, clutching her arms tight against the chill. When they reached the porch, Tom opened the door and stepped aside. "Go on," he said softly. The girl hesitated at the threshold, peering into the warm light spilling from inside. For a second, she looked ready to bolt. Then, as if some instinct told her it was safe, she stepped forward. Bare feet meeting the worn wooden floor. Tom followed, closing the door behind her. The sound of the latch clicked softly through the quiet room. For years, that house had been filled with nothing but wind and silence. But tonight, something changed. It wasn't loud or sudden. It came softly, like the rustle of dry leaves or the breath of a lost soul finding shelter at last. And though Tom Callahan didn't yet know her name, deep down, he sensed that this meeting by the river would ripple through the rest of his life, like a stone dropped in still water. Inside the small wooden cabin, the world grew quiet again. The door creaked shut behind them, sealing out the chill of the desert night. Tom Callahan bent down by the stove and struck a match. The flame flared, caught on the dry wood, and spread slowly until the fire began to crackle and glow. Orange light flickered across the walls, dancing over the old beams, the saddle hanging by the door, and the rifle propped against the corner. The place was plain, built for living, not for comfort. But the fire made it feel less empty somehow. Tom poured hot water from the kettle into a tin cup, the steam curling upward. He set it gently on the table in front of the girl. "Here," he said quietly. She didn't move at first. Her dark eyes stayed fixed on the cup, wary, as though it might be taken from her the moment she reached for it. Then, slowly, she lifted her hands. They were small, rough at the edges, trembling just enough for him to notice. When she brought the cup to her lips, Tom turned away, pretending to busy himself at the stove, though he was watching from the corner of his eye. He didn't want her to feel stared at. The poor thing had probably been looked at enough by crueler eyes. For the first time in years, another sound joined the wind in his house, the faint, fragile rhythm of another person breathing. It felt strange, almost sacred. Tom rubbed a calloused hand over his beard, trying to steady the feeling in his chest. He wasn't sure what had drawn her here, or what kind of trouble she'd escaped. But she looked half-starved, worn down to the bone, and he knew one thing for certain. If he turned her away, she wouldn't last the night. He reached for the wool blanket folded over the back of the chair and placed it gently on the couch near the fire. "You can sleep here?" he said softly, keeping his voice low and even, like he might talk to a nervous horse. The girl didn't speak. She only gave the faintest nod, barely a movement. But it was enough. Enough to tell him she understood. Enough to stir something deep inside him, something he thought had turned to dust long ago. Tom stood there a moment longer, uncertain of what to do with his hands. He wasn't used to company. He wasn't used to feeling responsible for anyone but himself. Finally, he walked to the small room down the hall, boots echoing softly on the floorboards. He didn't close the door all the way. Through the narrow gap, he could still see the flicker of the fire and the small shape of the girl curled on the couch, wrapped in the blanket. The desert wind swept gently against the windows, whispering through the cracks. The house had always been filled with that lonely sound, but tonight it was different. The silence wasn't hollow anymore. It was alive, breathing, warm. Tom lay down on his bed, but didn't sleep right away. He stared up at the ceiling, the glow from the next room washing faintly across the floor. He could hear the steady rhythm of her breathing now. Soft, fragile, human. It struck him how strange it felt to care again, to feel something beyond the weight of routine. For years, he'd built his life out of fences and quiet, thinking it was safer that way. But all it took was a frightened girl by a river to make those walls crack. Before sleep finally claimed him, Tom whispered to himself, "Just one night, that's all." But even as he said it, a part of him already knew. Nothing in this desert stays the same once the wind decides to change. The sun crept gently through the thin curtains, spilling stripes of gold across the wooden floor. For the first time in years, Tom Callahan woke to the sound of another person moving in his house. It wasn't loud, just the faint rustle of a blanket and the soft creak of a chair. Still, it was enough to remind him that this morning wasn't like all the others. He sat on the edge of his bed for a moment, listening. The wind outside had quieted. The land was still, as if the desert itself was holding its breath. Then he stood, pulled on his worn boots, and walked toward the main room. There she was, the girl from the river, sitting by the window wrapped in his old wool blanket. The fire from last night had burned down to glowing embers, painting her face in soft orange light. Her dark eyes followed the sunbeams slipping through the cracks of the wooden walls, and for the first time, Tom noticed that her fear seemed to have loosened its grip a little. He didn't want to startle her, so he cleared his throat quietly and gave a small nod. "Mornin'," he said. She turned, blinking against the light, her expression cautious but calm. She didn't answer, but she didn't look afraid either. Tom moved toward the stove, lighting it again with a few quick strikes of a match. The smell of wood smoke and old coffee filled the air. He took out a small loaf of bread left from yesterday, cut it in half, and set it on a tin plate. Then he poured warm water into a cup and slid it gently toward her. "Eat," he said simply, tapping the edge of the plate. The girl hesitated. Her fingers clutched the blanket a little tighter, eyes darting between the food and his face. Then, as if deciding she could trust him, she reached out, carefully, like someone handling something fragile, and took a small bite. Tom sat down across from her, pretending not to watch too closely. But inside, something stirred, something old and unfamiliar. She ate slowly, chewing each piece like it was the first real meal she'd had in days. Watching her, Tom realized he wasn't just feeding a stranger. He was keeping her alive. He didn't know who she was or where she came from, but the sight of her, thin, quiet, determined, made him feel a kind of duty he hadn't felt since long before the war, long before the world had turned hard. After a few minutes, she looked up, her eyes softer now. Tom caught her gaze and decided to try something. "You need a name," he said slowly, pointing to her, then tapping his chest. "Tom," she blinked, tilting her head slightly, trying to understand. Tom thought back to the last time he'd been in town, how one of the traders had mentioned a missing Apache girl named Nita. It felt right somehow. He pointed again. "Nita," he said clearly. Her lips parted. She repeated it, quietly at first. "Nita." The sound trembled a little, like her voice hadn't been used in a long time. Tom felt his throat tighten. "That's you," he said softly. The girl smiled, a small, shy smile that came and went like sunlight through clouds. But that single moment, that fragile warmth, made the room feel alive. It was as though the morning light itself had chosen to settle inside his home. He didn't say it aloud, but deep down, Tom knew. The name wasn't just hers now. It belonged to the quiet hope stirring between them, the kind that could melt even the coldest years of solitude. Outside, the wind rose again, whispering through the dry mesquite. But inside the cabin, there was something stronger than silence. A heartbeat, faint but steady, shared between two souls who had somehow found each other in the vast emptiness of the Arizona plains. The days that followed settled into a strange, easy rhythm. Quiet, steady, almost peaceful. The kind of peace that belongs to wide skies and slow mornings. Nita rose early, sometimes before Tom did, and moved about the ranch like she'd been born there. She learned fast. The girl had a way of watching everything closely, how Tom brushed the horses, how he shoveled grain into the trough, how he stacked wood in the stove until it burned just right. By the third day, she could do it all without needing a word. Tom kept his distance at first, letting her find her place. But sometimes, when she'd laugh softly after spilling water or drop a piece of bread into the fire by accident, he found himself smiling too. Quietly, involuntarily. He couldn't remember the last time he'd done that. That small laugh of hers, light and shy, did something to him. It reached into the hollow place inside his chest and stirred something alive again. In the evenings, they'd sit out on the porch together. The desert air cooled fast once the sun dropped, and Nita would wrap herself in the same blanket from that first night. She didn't talk much. Maybe she didn't know how. But she watched everything with those dark, thoughtful eyes. The way the stars came out one by one. The way the wind moved through the tall grass. Sometimes she'd hum, so soft it could have been mistaken for the wind itself. And every time, Tom would sit a little straighter, like listening to something he hadn't known he missed. Life on the ranch began to feel different, less lonely, less hollow. But peace in the frontier was like glass, beautiful, fragile, and easily broken. When Tom rode into town a week later for supplies, The world outside had already begun to change. The general store was busier than usual, and people were talking. Low voices, sharp words, passing from one mouth to another. "Apache girl gone missing from the reservation," someone said near the counter. 2 days now. Could be anywhere." Tom kept his face calm as he loaded sacks of flour and coffee onto the counter. "You hear about it, Callahan?" the storekeeper asked. "They say she ran off alone. Sheriff's men been riding all over looking for her." Tom nodded once. "Heard something about it." He didn't ask questions, didn't offer anything more. He just paid for his goods, tipped his hat, and walked out. As he saddled his horse, he could feel their eyes on him, curious, maybe suspicious. But Tom had been quiet all his life. Silence was his shield, and that day it served him well. On the ride home, he kept his eyes on the horizon. The land stretched wide and empty, the sky blazing in orange and gold. The wind brushed against his face, dry and warm. Somewhere deep inside, a knot began to form, a quiet understanding that things couldn't stay the same. When he reached the ranch, Nita was sitting on the porch, brushing Daisy's mane with careful hands. She looked up as he approached, the sun catching in her hair, and smiled faintly. That same soft, fragile smile that made the world feel lighter. Tom dismounted and set down his supplies, forcing himself to smile back. But his thoughts were heavy. He knew the men from town would keep searching, and if they ever came this far, they'd find her. Still, when he looked at her, that small figure wrapped in sunlight, gentle but strong, he knew he'd already made his choice. The world could keep its rules, its talk, its fear. Tom Callahan had chosen his side. It was late afternoon when Tom Callahan heard the sound. The soft, rhythmic thud of hooves carried across the open plain, steady, measured, and too many to be random travelers. The kind of sound that makes a man stop what he's doing and listen harder. Tom set down the bucket of water he'd been carrying and squinted towards the west. The sun hung low, burning gold across the horizon, and through the shimmer of heat, he saw them. 4 riders moving slow and deliberate along the dirt trail that cut across his land. His gut tightened. Trouble had a way of announcing itself long before it reached your door. He turned toward the barn. Nita was there, brushing Daisy's mane, her small hands moving in soft, careful strokes. She looked up at the sound of his boots crunching against the dry earth. One glance at his face was enough, she understood. "Inside," Tom said quietly, motioning toward the house. Her eyes widened for just a second before she nodded. No hesitation, no questions. She dropped the brush, touched Daisy's neck one last time, and hurried toward the door. Her bare feet made no sound on the porch boards. The door clicked softly shut behind her. Tom took a slow breath, adjusted his hat, and stepped onto the porch. The wood creaked under his weight. He leaned against the post like it was any other day, one boot crossed over the other, his face calm as stone. The kind of calm that comes from a lifetime of silence. The riders drew closer. Dust swirled around their horses' hooves, catching the light like smoke. Tom recognized 2 of them, ranch hands from the north, men who'd shared a drink with him once or twice in town. They weren't lawmen, not exactly, but they were the kind who liked to act like it when someone gave them a reason. "Evening, Callahan," the lead man called, tipping his hat. "Evening," Tom answered. "Been a long ride today. You seen anything unusual out here?" Tom's eyes didn't move from the man's face. Nothing out of the ordinary. The second rider shifted in his saddle. "Word is, an Apache girl's run off from the reservation. Folks say she's been spotted heading this way." The silence between them stretched thin. The wind moved through the dry grass, whispering low like it wanted to stay out of this. Tom took his time before speaking. "Ain't seen anyone," he said finally. His voice was low, steady, like gravel underfoot. "Just me and this land." The riders glanced at one another. They knew Tom Callahan, a man of few words but never a liar. One of them opened his mouth as if to push further, but the leader raised a hand. "Reckon that's good enough for us," he said after a pause. "Didn't figure you for the type to hide anyone anyhow." Tom gave a small nod. "You figured right." They tipped their hats, turned their horses, and rode off the way they came. Dust followed them like a long shadow until they disappeared into the amber haze. Tom stood there a while, watching until the sound of hooves faded completely. Then he exhaled. Slow, deep. The kind of breath that carried both relief and guilt. When he stepped back inside, Nita was standing near the window, her fingers clutching the edge of the curtain. She'd seen the whole thing. Her eyes were wide, not with fear this time, but something else, understanding. Tom met her gaze and shook his head gently. "They're gone," he said. She might not have caught the words, but she felt the meaning. The tension in her shoulders softened, and she took a careful step toward him. For a heartbeat, they stood there in silence, the air between them warm and heavy with unspoken truth. Tom had lied, for the first time in years, and he didn't regret a word of it. He wasn't a lawman, he wasn't a hero, but in that moment, he knew exactly who he was. A man who'd chosen mercy over rules, heart over fear. Outside, the sun dipped below the horizon, and the sky turned to fire. Inside, in that quiet wooden house, two souls breathed the same air, bound by a secret, by trust, and by a silent promise that neither of them would ever forget. When Tom stepped back into the cabin, the last of the daylight spilled across the floorboards like molten gold. The room smelled faintly of dust and smoke, the kind of scent that clung to old wood and long memories. Nita stood by the window, her slender hand trembling as she pulled the curtain aside. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence between them wasn't cold or heavy. It was alive, thick with the unspoken truth of what had just happened outside. Tom's boots creaked softly against the floor as he walked closer. The faint glow from the dying fire lit half his face, the rest hidden in shadow. Nita turned to him, her dark eyes wide but steady. She didn't say a word. She didn't have to. Their eyes met, and that was enough. She slowly reached out, her hand brushing the edge of the wooden table. He saw the faint tremor in her fingers as she laid her palm near his. She didn't touch him. Not quite. But the distance between them, the one built from fear, silence, and difference, began to fade. It was such a small thing, but to Tom Callahan, it felt bigger than words, bigger than all the noise of the world beyond his land. From that day on, the air in the cabin changed. The walls no longer echoed with emptiness. The rooms, once filled with nothing but wind, now carried the rhythm of two lives moving side by side. Every morning, Tom woke before sunrise, as he always had. But now, when he stepped outside, he'd find Nita already waiting, her blanket wrapped around her shoulders, her bare feet in the dew-soaked grass, eyes lifted toward the first blush of dawn. They worked together without needing to speak much. Tom showed her how to tie a fence knot, how to saddle Daisy, how to gather eggs without startling the hens. Nita learned quickly, her movements graceful but deliberate. When she made mistakes, she laughed, soft, breathy, like the desert wind slipping between canyon stones. Tom didn't laugh often, but when he did, it came quietly, almost shyly, as though his heart was remembering how. At dusk, they'd sit on the porch, the wide Arizona sky stretching above them, streaked with rose and violet. Nita would hum sometimes, her voice barely louder than the rustle of the mesquite trees. Tom would listen, hat tilted low, his hands resting on his knees. He didn't know what the tune meant, or if it came from her tribe, her memories, or her dreams. But he felt it, that calm, aching beauty. It settled into him like rain on dry earth. Nights in the desert were long, but no longer lonely. The stars seemed brighter now, closer somehow. The silence wasn't empty anymore. It was shared. Tom had always believed the ranch was a refuge for one man's solitude, a place to grow old and forgotten. But with Nita there, her laughter soft, her presence steady, he saw it differently. This wasn't just his home anymore. It had become something living, something sacred, a shelter not just from the world, but from the loneliness that had ruled him for too long. As he sat beside her one evening, the stars glimmering above and the faint hum of life around them, Tom understood something simple and profound. Sometimes, you don't have to speak to be understood. Sometimes, all it takes is one quiet soul meeting another, and the whole world feels less empty. Tom Callahan had always known the desert had its own kind of honesty. It gave nothing for free, and it took what it pleased. But that morning, as the light broke across the valley and the river shimmered like molten silver, he felt something the desert rarely offered, a sense of ending. He had saddled Daisy early, the air still cool enough to hold a faint mist above the ground. Nita sat behind him, her small hands resting lightly against his coat as the horse moved down the familiar trail. She didn't ask where they were going, and Tom didn't tell her. Some things didn't need words. The ride was long and quiet. They crossed open plains, fields of brittle grass swaying in the morning wind. The mountains watched from afar, their peaks sharp against the soft blue sky. Every hoofbeat seemed to echo deeper than usual, like the land itself knew this wasn't just another day. By midday, they reached the river, a wide, winding stretch of water lined with mesquite and cottonwood. Smoke curled lazily from a cluster of chimneys nearby. It was a small settlement, the kind that had grown quietly over time, part settlers, part Apache families who'd built homes here after leaving the reservations. The air carried the scent of baked bread and cedar smoke, and voices drifted across the open ground, soft, rhythmic, speaking in a language Tom didn't understand, but Nita did. When Daisy slowed near the edge of the camp, Nita straightened in the saddle. Her eyes widened. She could hear it, her language, her people. Children laughing, women talking as they pounded grain, a man singing low near the riverbank. For the first time since that night by the river, the fear in her face melted into something pure, recognition. Tom stopped the horse and dismounted, boots sinking slightly into the damp earth. He turned to help her down, but Nita was already moving, sliding off gently and standing on her own 2 feet. She looked around as though she was seeing color for the first time. Tom took off his hat, holding it loosely in both hands. He didn't say a word. He just watched as a group of women turned and noticed Nita, one of them older, with kind eyes and braids streaked with silver. They spoke to her softly, and Nita answered. Her voice was stronger now, alive in the sound of her own tongue. Tom couldn't understand their words, but he didn't need to. The light in Nita's eyes said enough. He felt something twist deep inside him. Not regret, not sorrow exactly, but that quiet ache that comes when a man realizes he's been holding on to something that was never his to keep. She turned to him then, her dark hair brushing against her shoulders, the wind lifting the edge of her shawl. For a moment, she just looked at him, steady, grateful, silent. Then she smiled. Not the shy, uncertain smile from before, but a true one, full and radiant. Tom nodded once, his throat tight. "You're home now," he said softly. She didn't understand the words, but she felt them. She took a step closer, pressed her hand over her heart, then touched her fingers lightly to his chest. That was her answer. He watched her walk toward the people waiting by the river, her small frame moving with new strength. Around her, voices rose in welcome. The world seemed bigger all of a sudden, stretching far beyond his small ranch, his small routines. And though Tom stood alone by the river, he knew part of him would stay here, in her laughter, in her freedom, in the warmth of that single smile. The wind picked up, carrying the sound of the river downstream. Tom slid his hat back on, mounted Daisy, and turned toward the open land. Behind him, life began again. Ahead, only the horizon, wide, endless, and quiet as the man who rode toward it. The weeks that followed drifted by like the slow current of the river, calm, steady, and full of quiet purpose. Tom Callahan didn't expect to see Nita again after leaving her by the settlement that day. But a week later, just as the morning light broke over the horizon, he heard the familiar sound of hoofbeats outside his gate. When he stepped onto the porch, there she was, sitting tall on Daisy, her hair tied loosely, the same faint smile on her face. She had a small basket in her arms, wrapped in cloth. Tom leaned against the porch post, tipping his hat with a grin that came easier than it used to. "You found your way back," he said softly. She didn't speak, just nodded and held out the basket. Inside were fresh herbs, small loaves of bread, and a pouch of wild tobacco. Gifts in her own way. After that, Nita came every week. Sometimes she stayed for a day, sometimes just long enough to help him fix a fence or tend to the horses. She never stayed the night again. Not because she wasn't welcome, but because she didn't need to. The fear that once shadowed her had turned into quiet confidence. They didn't talk much. They didn't have to. Their silences were easy now, the kind that speaks louder than words. She'd sit on the porch mending an old blanket while Tom sharpened his tools, the soft rasp of metal against stone blending with the wind. Every now and then, he'd glance up, and she'd smile without looking away from her work. There were 2 cups on the table now, 2 plates, 2 sets of footprints on the porch steps. It wasn't companionship in the way the world might understand, but it was something deeper, a bond carved out of trust, out of shared silence and survival. Sometimes, when the sun sank low and painted the sky in bands of copper and rose, Tom would catch himself thinking about how strange life could be. A year ago, he'd been just another old rancher fading into the land, a man with nothing left but routine. Then, a scared Apache girl had stumbled onto his property, and suddenly, his days had shape again. Meaning. He'd once believed kindness was a dangerous thing, a weakness that got men killed in the old days. But now he understood that maybe it wasn't weakness at all. Maybe it was the only thing worth holding on to. Nita's laughter, faint and rare, was worth more than all the gold the desert could hide. The way she cared for Daisy, or the way she quietly refilled his cup before he even noticed. Those moments made the ranch feel alive again. Tom often thought about the risk he'd taken, the law he'd bent, the questions he'd dodged in town. And yet, when he looked around, at the home that no longer felt empty, at the second cup waiting on the table, He couldn't bring himself to regret a single thing. One evening, as the stars began to rise, Nita stood from her chair and handed him a small carved pendant, a smooth piece of riverstone with a symbol etched into its surface. She pointed to it, then to her heart. Tom took it, his weathered hand brushing hers. "Thank you," he said quietly. She smiled, that same steady, knowing smile, then turned toward the darkening trail. As he watched her ride away, the wind moved gently through the tall grass, carrying the faint scent of cedar and rain. Tom Callahan stood there a long time, the pendant warm in his palm. He'd spent half his life searching for purpose in the dust and the silence. But now, he realized, it had been here all along, waiting in the small, steady rhythm of two lives that had crossed at the right moment. And in that knowledge, the loneliness finally began to fade. Years passed, as quietly as the river that wound through the valley. The world changed. Rail lines pushed farther west, new fences carved up the open range, and towns rose where there had once been only dust and silence. But out near the red hills of Arizona, the small ranch of Tom Callahan remained much the same. A weathered house, a leaning barn, and a porch that still faced the sunset. Tom grew older, the lines on his face deep as canyon shadows. His hair turned the color of dry sage, and his hands, once strong enough to tame wild horses, had grown slow and careful. Yet there was peace in the way he moved now, a man who had made his peace not with the world, but with himself. Every so often, riders from town would pass his gate. They'd wave, and he'd tip his hat in return. Some knew his name, others only the story. It had become a kind of legend about the rancher who had once sheltered a young Apache girl and sent her back to her people when the law came looking. No one knew exactly how the story ended, and Tom never told. He didn't need to. On quiet evenings, when the sky burned orange and violet, he would sit on his porch with 2 tin cups on the table, one for him, one left empty. He'd pour coffee into both, the steam rising and twisting in the cool air. Sometimes he'd talk softly to the empty chair across from him, his voice warm and calm, as though someone still sat there listening. Folks in town said they'd seen a woman riding through the valley now and then. Tall, wrapped in a dark shawl, her hair braided with river beads. They said she'd stop near the Callahan ranch, leave flowers by the fence post, and disappear before sunrise. No one ever asked who she was. They didn't need to. One evening, the preacher from town rode out to visit Tom. He found him sitting on the porch, eyes fixed on the horizon, his old rifle across his knees, the air thick with the smell of rain. They talked until dusk, about God, about the land, about the strange ways grace found a man when he wasn't looking for it. As the preacher stood to leave, Tom looked out over the fields one last time. The wind picked up, carrying with it the scent of mesquite and distant thunder. His voice was soft but sure when he spoke. "Sometimes," he said, "God doesn't send us miracles. He sends us people." It was the last thing anyone ever heard him say. The next morning they found him still on the porch, hat resting low over his eyes, the coffee beside him gone cold. His dog lay at his feet, silent and watchful. The air was calm, too calm, and for a moment even the wind seemed to pause in respect. After that, the people of Arizona kept his story alive. Travelers passing through would stop by the old ranch and swear they could hear faint laughter in the breeze, the echo of hooves fading into the distance, and a man's voice whispering through the tall grass. They said the wind carried his words, a reminder carved deep into the heart of the desert. Kindness is the truest mark a man can leave behind. And so Tom Callahan's land remained as he left it. Simple, quiet, and full of life. Not the life of one man, but the echo of two souls who once crossed paths beneath an endless western sky and changed each other forever.